We just discussed how social media might influence our mindset, but what about our individual well-being? And in particular, what about younger people amongst whom it's extremely popular? Philip Powell is at the University of Sheffield. Hi, Philip. So thanks for joining us. Do we know what effect social media has on someone's well-being?
So the evidence on this is mixed, and the first thing to say is that social media can have positive effects on well-being by decreasing loneliness, providing sources of support for people, and even providing a venue for them to affirm their sense of self-worth by reviewing their profile. But what we have as well as that is a series of large representative national survey studies that have been carried out across different countries that show a significant negative relationship between the time spent on social networking and people's well-being. And we know that these effects are largely concentrated at the top end of use, so people that spend an excessive time on social media, which is normally defined as around greater than 2 hours per day. Some recent research by scholars at Oxford University has actually shown that a low to moderate amount of social media use can be beneficial, and they've termed this the Goldilocks effect.
Okay, so some use is good, but a lot of use is associated with negative things. But how do we know that people who are sort of less well aren't just more likely to spend hours and hours on social media because of this?
It's definitely a concern, and the majority of research is associational, that just shows a correlational relationship between social media use and lower well-being. There have been some studies that have looked how the two things may interact over time, so it's been shown that changes in social media use are associated with changes in well-being. But that still doesn't mean that the change in, for example, Facebook usage causes the change in well-being. It's possible that another variable may influence the two things independently. Now, in our own research, we've tried to overcome this by using sophisticated statistical techniques. They are used when we don't have experimental data, but we're able to use additional data that has a one-way effect on our outcomes. We can essentially estimate the association between social media use and this additional data, which was internet connection speeds from Ofcom. And by estimating the association between those two things and the strength of this association with well-being, we're able to derive as close to causal relationships as possible.
And this is still indicating that a lot of use is negative. So what kind of effects is it having on well-being, and do we have any ideas why?
These things include reduced life satisfaction, increased anxiety and depression, and reduced happiness. So these are things that can be distinguished but are generally related to one another. The method in which increased social media use may result in low well-being is likely to be multifactorial. It may involve, for example, instances of cyberbullying, negative comparisons with others, exposure to inappropriate content online, and also through its association with disruption to physical and healthy daily activities such as sleep and exercise and other positive activities for our well-being.
You mentioned cyberbullying there. So Facebook previously only allowed over 13-year-olds to use their site, but recently they've launched Messenger Kids, which is a service aimed just at preteens. So do we know about how social media affects young people in particular?
So the first thing to point out is often children under the age of consent are frequently using social networking sites already. In our own data, we found worse effects of social media use on well-being in those that were aged 13 and over, and not at those that were younger. And there are a number of reasons why this may be the case. So we also know from separate data that cyberbullying increases over time in the early teen years. And we also know that there are increased pressures on children and young people to fit in the teen years.
Social media is obviously a very broad term. There's lots of different types of social media and there's lots of different ways to use it. So do we know what kind of different effects different social media has?
There was a recent survey by the Royal Society for Public Health, 14 to 24-year-olds, and they had their participants rank the main social media platforms, so that's Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter and YouTube, and they had them rank them on a range of health-related factors, including depression, body image, experience of bullying. And what they found is actually that YouTube came out as the most positive and Instagram was the most negative. and they don't actually elaborate on why that may be the case. But we could, for example, hypothesize that because Instagram is a platform that involves user-generated photos, and we know that idealized and filtered photos are particularly problematic for young people's well-being. The other thing to mention is there's been a distinction throughout the literature between passive and active use. And now passive use describes things like looking at people's profile pages and liking, whereas active use involves actively connecting and chatting with people. And it tends to be the passive use that is particularly problematic for well-being.
Do we know anything about how social media affects our ability to learn, I suppose specifically with children?
No, I think there's a paucity of research in this area, and this is something that we'd like to look into in the future.
It'd be interesting to see what that says, but it certainly makes procrastinating easier. What do we do about this? I mean, do we need to do anything?
So there are three main approaches we could take, and they're not all mutually exclusive. So the first is that we try to reduce or restrict the amount of time that children and young people, and maybe even adults, spend on social media. The Royal Society for Public Health has called for example, pop-up warnings on heavy usage on social media sites, and this is supported by a majority of young people that they surveyed. A second approach is that we focus on this idea of usage. So it's not amount of time per se, but it's what people are doing online. So we need to generate platforms for social media that encourage active use and discourage passive browsing of information and social comparison. And finally, there's the idea that's supported by places like the Education Policy Institute, that we actually have a duty to educate our young people in the safe use of social media and equip them with digital skills so they can cope with problematic behaviours online.
Many thanks. That's Phil Powell from Sheffield University.